In the dimly lit corridors of the Pentagon, where secrets are currency and silence is survival, there exists a phrase so classified that only 7 people in the world know its true meaning. When spoken, it has the power to stop generals mid-sentence, freeze admirals in their tracks, and make even the most hardened military veterans question everything they thought they knew about warfare. Colonel Marcus Steele had heard whispers of such code words during his 25 years of service. He'd seen classified operations that would make Hollywood blockbusters look like children's bedtime stories. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for the moment when a 19-year-old girl with dirt under her fingernails and terror in her eyes would walk into his office and utter 2 words that would shatter his understanding of reality forever. Phantom 7. What happened next would either save the world or destroy everything he'd sworn to protect. And it all started with a girl who wasn't supposed to exist, carrying knowledge that could topple governments and rewrite the very fabric of modern warfare. This is the story of how 2 simple words spoken by the most unlikely person imaginable would trigger the most dangerous military operation in human history, and why Colonel Steele's shocked expression was just the beginning of a nightmare that would consume them all. Of the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps as Colonel Marcus Steele reviewed the morning briefings in his Pentagon office. 25 years of military service had taught him to expect the unexpected, but Tuesday morning in November was supposed to be routine. Intelligence reports, training schedules, budget allocations, the mundane machinery that kept the most powerful military in the world functioning. His coffee had grown cold an hour ago, forgotten beside a stack of classified documents that would make front-page news if they ever saw daylight. Steele rubbed his weathered face, feeling every one of his 48 years weighing down on his shoulders like a lead blanket. The morning sun streaming through his reinforced windows cast long shadows across the American flag that stood sentinel in the corner of his office. The knock on his door was soft, almost hesitant. "Come in," he called without looking up from the satellite imagery spread across his mahogany desk. The door creaked open, and Steele expected to see his aide, Sergeant Martinez, with another stack of papers requiring his signature. Instead, he found himself staring at a girl who looked like she'd just escaped from hell itself. She couldn't have been more than 19, maybe 20 at most. Her dark hair hung in matted strands around a face that was equal parts beautiful and haunted. Dirt streaked her cheeks, and her clothes, a torn green jacket over faded jeans, looked like she'd been sleeping rough for weeks. But it was her eyes that made Steele's breath catch in his throat. They held a depth of knowledge that no teenager should possess, a weight of secrets that seemed to press against her very soul. "Sir," Sergeant Martinez appeared behind her, his face flushed with embarrassment and confusion. "I'm sorry, Colonel. She just walked past security somehow. Nobody can figure out how she got in here. The guards swear they never saw her, but the cameras show her walking through 3 checkpoints like she belonged here." Steele set down his pen slowly, his training kicking in. Unauthorized personnel in the Pentagon was a nightmare scenario. This girl should have been stopped at the first security barrier, questioned, and processed through proper channels. The fact that she'd made it to his office undetected meant either massive security failure or something far more troubling. "It's all right, Martinez. Close the door." Steele's voice remained calm, but his hand unconsciously moved closer to the panic button hidden beneath his desk. "Miss, I'm going to need you to explain how you got here and what you want." The girl stepped forward, her movements graceful despite her obvious exhaustion. When she spoke, her voice carried a slight accent that Steele couldn't quite place. Eastern European, maybe Russian. "Colonel Steele, my name is Elena Volkov. I know you don't know me, but I need your help. People are going to die if you don't listen to what I have to say. Miss Volkov, you're in serious trouble right now. This is one of the most secure buildings in the world, and you've somehow bypassed multiple security systems. Before we discuss anything else, I need to understand how that's possible." Elena's laugh was bitter, hollow. "Security systems?" She reached into her jacket pocket, and Steele tensed, ready to hit the alarm. Instead, she pulled out a small device that looked like a modified smartphone. "Your security systems are designed to detect threats from the outside, Colonel. They're not programmed to recognize someone who was trained by the same people who helped design them." The implications of her words sent ice through Steele's veins. "Explain." "I was born in a facility that doesn't exist on any map. trained by instructors who never officially served in any military. Taught skills that no government will ever acknowledge teaching. Elena's voice grew stronger as she spoke, as if sharing her secret was lifting a burden from her shoulders. For 19 years, I was told I was being prepared to serve my country. It wasn't until 3 weeks ago that I learned which country that actually was. Steele leaned back in his chair, his mind racing through possibilities. Russian sleeper agents, deep cover operatives, psychological warfare, all were plausible explanations. But something about Elena's demeanor told him this was bigger than standard espionage. Go on. The facility was called the Garden by those who ran it. 43 of us lived there, trained there, grew up thinking we were special. We learned languages, combat techniques, hacking, infiltration, psychological manipulation. We were told we were being prepared for a special program that would protect innocent people around the world. Elena moved to the window, staring out at the Washington skyline as if seeing it for the first time. Last month, they separated us into smaller groups. My group was told we were finally ready for our first real mission. We were excited, Colonel. We thought we were going to be heroes. What was the mission? The girl's reflection in the window seemed to age 10 years as she spoke. They called it Operation Broken Arrow. We were to infiltrate a series of American military installations, gather intelligence on defensive capabilities, and plant devices that could disable communications and weapons systems in the event of a coordinated attack. Steele felt his blood pressure spike. If what she was saying was true, they were dealing with a massive security breach that could compromise national defense. Who sent you? Who's running this garden? That's where it gets complicated, Colonel. Elena turned back to face him, and Steele saw tears forming in her eyes. 3 days into our mission, my teammate Sarah started having doubts. She'd noticed discrepancies in our intelligence packets, things that didn't match what we'd been taught about American military procedures. We decided to investigate. She paused, taking a shuddering breath. What we found in our handler's laptop changed everything. The garden isn't Russian, Colonel. It's not Chinese or North Korean or any foreign government. The people who trained us, who molded us into weapons, who taught us to slip past your security systems like ghosts, they're Americans. The words hit Steele like a physical blow. That's impossible. I thought so too. But the evidence is undeniable. Financial records, communication logs, operational directives, all of it traced back to a network of current and former U.S. intelligence officials. People with clearances so high they could walk into this building and access classified materials without question. Elena reached into her other pocket and produced a small flash drive. Everything Sarah and I discovered is on this drive. Names, dates, financial transactions, operational plans. Enough evidence to expose a conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of American intelligence. Steele stared at the tiny device as if it were a live grenade. Why bring it to me? Why not go to the FBI, or the CIA, or because we don't know how deep this goes? We don't know who can be trusted. Elena's voice cracked with emotion. Sarah tried to contact someone in the FBI. They found her body yesterday morning, Colonel. Made it look like a car accident, but I know better. These people, whoever they are, they're willing to kill to protect their secret. The office fell silent except for the steady hum of the ventilation system. Steele found himself at a crossroads that could define the rest of his career and, possibly his life. Either this girl was the best actress he'd ever encountered, part of an elaborate foreign intelligence operation designed to sow discord within American intelligence agencies, or she was telling the truth about a domestic conspiracy that threatened everything he'd sworn to protect. Miss Volkov, these are serious allegations. If even half of what you're saying is true, it's all true, Colonel. Every word. Elena stepped closer to his desk, her eyes burning with desperate intensity. And there's more. The devices we planted, they're not just for gathering intelligence or disabling communications. We were told they were defensive systems, but Sarah found the real technical specifications. Steele's mouth went dry. What kind of specifications? The devices are designed to create electromagnetic pulses targeted at specific frequencies used by American military equipment. But that's not the worst part. Elena's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. They're also programmed to transmit location data for every piece of military hardware in their vicinity. Real-time positioning information that could be used to coordinate precision strikes against American forces anywhere in the world. The implications were staggering. If foreign agents had somehow infiltrated American intelligence agencies and were using American-trained operatives to plant surveillance devices throughout U.S. military installations, it represented a security catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. How many installations have been compromised? 37 so far. Army bases, Navy yards, Air Force installations, even some facilities I'd never heard of. Places so classified that just knowing their names is supposed to be a death sentence. Elena sat down in the chair across from Steele's desk, her exhaustion finally showing through her determined facade. Colonel, I'm not a hero. I'm not even particularly brave. But I know the difference between protecting people and helping to destroy them. Whatever these devices are really meant to do, it's not protecting anyone. And the people who trained me, who I trusted with my life for 19 years, they're not the patriots they pretended to be. Steele reached for his secure phone, then stopped. Elena was right. If this conspiracy reached into the highest levels of American intelligence, a standard call could alert the very people they were trying to expose. He needed to think, to plan, to find a way to verify her claims without triggering a response that could get them both killed. Miss Volkov, Elena, I need you to understand something. What you're asking me to believe goes against everything I know about how our intelligence services operate. The kind of conspiracy you're describing would require dozens of people in positions of extreme trust to commit treason on a massive scale. I know how it sounds, Colonel. But I've seen the evidence. I've lived with these people for 19 years. I know their faces, their voices, their methods. They're real, and they're here, and they're using people like me to tear down everything you've spent your career defending. Steele stood and walked to his wall safe, entering a complex code that only 3 people in the Pentagon knew. From inside, he retrieved a small tablet device that looked similar to Elena's but was clearly military-grade equipment. This is a secure analysis terminal. It's isolated from all outside networks and designed to examine potentially hostile digital materials without compromising our systems. If you're willing to let me examine what's on that drive, we can start to determine if your claims have merit. Elena didn't hesitate. She placed the flash drive on Steele's desk and slid it toward him. Colonel, there's something else you need to know before you look at that data. Something that might make you think I'm completely insane. At this point, I'm prepared for anything. Elena took a deep breath, as if steeling herself for what came next. The garden wasn't just a training facility. It was an experiment. The people who ran it weren't just creating spies or saboteurs. They were testing something called cognitive integration protocols, methods of programming human minds to perform complex tasks without conscious awareness of their true purpose. Steele felt the blood drain from his face. Mind control was the stuff of conspiracy theories and science fiction, not legitimate military operations. Elena, that's impossible? I thought so too, until I started remembering things that had been blocked from my memory. Skills I shouldn't have, knowledge I'd never been taught, abilities that seemed to manifest without training. Elena's voice grew urgent. Colonel, I didn't just walk past your security systems. I subconsciously knew how to bypass them because the knowledge was programmed into my mind years ago. And I'm not the only one. The weight of her words settled on Steele like a funeral shroud. If Elena was telling the truth, they weren't just dealing with a spy ring or even a conspiracy within American intelligence. They were looking at something far more sinister, the systematic creation of programmable human weapons using American citizens as test subjects. How many others are there? 43 that I know of, but the facility had been operating for decades before my group arrived. There could be hundreds of people out there, Colonel. Sleepers who don't even know they're sleepers, programmed with skills and knowledge they can't consciously access until triggered. Elena leaned forward, her eyes pleading with him to believe. That flash drive contains more than just evidence of treason, Colonel. It contains proof that someone has been experimenting on American citizens for decades, turning them into unknowing agents of a conspiracy so deep that it might reach into the Pentagon itself. Steele stared at the small device on his desk, knowing that once he inserted it into the analysis terminal, there would be no going back. Either Elena Volkov was the most sophisticated enemy agent ever deployed against the United States, or she was a victim of crimes so horrific that exposing them could shake the foundations of American intelligence gathering. Colonel, Elena said quietly, before you examine that drive, I need to tell you one more thing. Something that might help you decide whether to trust me or have me arrested. What is it? Elena met his eyes directly, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. I know about Phantom 7, Colonel. I know what it really is, who controls it, and what they're planning to do with it. And if I'm right about what's on that drive, you're going to need that knowledge to stop something that will make the worst terrorist attack in history look like a minor inconvenience. The name hit Steele like a lightning bolt. Phantom 7 was a classification so secret that acknowledging its existence was grounds for immediate termination and possible treason charges. The fact that this girl knew the name meant either she was exactly what she claimed to be, an inside source with access to the deepest levels of American intelligence, or she was part of an enemy operation more sophisticated and dangerous than anything the United States had ever faced. Either way, Steele realized, his quiet Tuesday morning had just become the most important day of his military career. And, possibly the last day of his life. Colonel Steele's hand trembled slightly as he inserted Elena's flash drive into the secure analysis terminal. The device hummed to life, its screen displaying a series of security protocols and encryption warnings. For a moment that felt like an eternity, nothing happened except the software of cooling fans and the distant sound of traffic outside the Pentagon. Then, the files began to appear. The first document made Steele's stomach lurch. It was a financial ledger showing payments totaling nearly $50 million over the past 5 years, all traced to accounts linked to current Department of Defense personnel. Names he recognized scrolled past: Deputy Director Harrison from the Defense Intelligence Agency, General Patricia Walsh from Strategic Command, even Assistant Secretary Morrison from the Pentagon's own budget office. This can't be real, Steele whispered, but, even as he spoke the words, he knew they were. The financial records were too detailed, too precise to be fabricated. Account numbers, routing information, transaction dates, everything matched the style and format of legitimate Defense Department financial documentation. Elena stood behind his chair, watching the screen over his shoulder. Keep reading, Colonel. The financial records are just the beginning. The next series of files contained operational communications that made Steele's blood run cold. Encrypted messages between Garden operatives and their handlers revealed the scope of their infiltration. Military bases from Fort Bragg to Pearl Harbor had been compromised. Weapons testing facilities, satellite communication stations, even NORAD installations had been penetrated by Elena's fellow trainees. But it was the technical specifications that truly horrified him. The devices Elena's team had planted weren't just surveillance equipment, they were Trojan horses designed to give enemy forces complete access to American military communications and targeting systems. In the event of a conflict, hostile forces could use these devices to turn America's own defensive network against itself. Jesus Christ, Steele breathed. If these specifications are accurate, enemy forces could coordinate simultaneous attacks against every major military installation in the United States. They'd know our troop movements, our defense positions, even our nuclear response protocols. Now you understand why Sarah had to die, Elena said grimly. This isn't just about selling secrets to the highest bidder. This is about systematically dismantling American military capability from within. Steele continued reading, each document more damaging than the last. Personnel records showed that Garden operatives had been placed in key positions throughout the military hierarchy. Supply sergeants who could poison food supplies. Communications specialists who could disrupt battlefield coordination. Even medical personnel who could compromise field hospitals during wartime. How long has this been going on? Steele asked, though he dreaded the answer. The earliest documents on that drive date back 17 years. But, based on conversations I overheard at the garden, the program started in the late 1980s. We might be looking at nearly 4 decades of systematic infiltration. The implications were staggering. If Elena was right, an entire generation of military personnel could be unknowing sleeper agents, programmed to activate when given the proper signals. The garden wasn't just creating spies, it was breeding a cancer that had metastasized throughout the entire American defense establishment. Steele opened another file and found himself staring at photographs that made his skin crawl. Images of children as young as 8 or 9 undergoing what appeared to be medical procedures. Brain scans showing unusual neural activity patterns. Clinical notes documenting cognitive modification protocols and behavioral programming sequences. They started most of us young, Elena explained, her voice hollow with remembered trauma. Orphans, mostly. Kids from broken homes who wouldn't be missed if something went wrong. They told us we were special, that we were being prepared for important work that would help protect innocent people. This is monstrous, Steele said, scrolling through page after page of clinical documentation. These are children. American children being subjected to illegal medical experimentation. The worst part is that most of us never realized what was being done to us. The programming was so subtle, so carefully integrated into our normal education and training, that we thought our abilities were natural. It wasn't until Sarah and I started investigating that we began to understand how deeply we'd been manipulated. Steele came to a file labeled Phantom 7 Integration Protocols and hesitated. Phantom 7 was so classified that even acknowledging its existence could end his career. But, Elena had already mentioned it, and if these files contained information about one of America's most secret defense programs, he had to know. He opened the file and immediately wished he hadn't. Phantom 7, according to the documents, wasn't just a classified defense program, it was the ultimate goal of the garden's operations. For decades, the conspirators had been working to gain access to what the files described as America's final failsafe protocol. The documents revealed that Phantom 7 was a last-resort defense system designed to protect critical government functions in the event of total military collapse. The system included hardened communication networks, emergency command bunkers, and, most disturbingly, authorization codes for autonomous weapons systems that could operate without human oversight. In the wrong hands, Phantom 7 could be used to launch attacks against American cities while making it appear that the orders had come from legitimate government sources. They're not trying to defeat America in open warfare, Steele realized with growing horror. They're planning to turn our own defense systems against us. Make it look like our own government ordered the destruction of American cities. Elena nodded grimly. The perfect false flag operation. Attack America using America's own weapons, then blame the chaos on a government conspiracy. The resulting civil unrest would tear the country apart from within. Steele continued reading, discovering that the conspirators had been working for years to place garden operatives in positions where they could access Phantom 7 protocols. According to the documents, they were close to achieving their goal. All they needed were the final authorization codes, which were held by only 7 individuals in the entire U.S. government. Colonel, Elena said quietly, I need to tell you something else. Something that's going to make this situation even worse than you already think it is. Steele looked up from the screen, noting the fear in Elena's eyes. What is it? Before I escaped from the garden, I overheard a conversation between 2 of the handlers. They were talking about Phase 7 activation and mentioned that the final authorization codes had been obtained. According to what I heard, the operation is scheduled to begin in 72 hours. The words hit Steele like a physical blow. 72 hours. 3 days to prevent what could be the most devastating attack on American soil in the nation's history. An attack that would be carried out using America's own defense systems and blamed on the American government itself. Elena, we need to contact. Steele stopped mid-sentence as the implications sank in. Who could they contact? If the conspiracy reached as deeply into American intelligence as the documents suggested, any attempt to raise the alarm through normal channels could trigger the very attack they were trying to prevent. That's why I came to you, Colonel, Elena said. According to the files, you're not part of the conspiracy. Your security clearance is high enough to access Phantom 7 protocols, but your psychological profile makes you an unlikely recruit for treasonous activities. You're clean, Colonel. Maybe the only clean person with enough authority to do something about this. Steele felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. He was just one man, a mid-level colonel in a massive bureaucracy. How was he supposed to stop a conspiracy that had been decades in the making? There's more, Elena continued. The files contain information about other Garden operatives who might be willing to help. People like me who discovered the truth about their programming and want to stop what's happening. How do we know we can trust them? If these people have been programmed since childhood, how do we know their desire to help isn't just another layer of conditioning? We don't, Elena admitted. But, according to the psychological profiles in those files, the programming becomes unstable when operatives are exposed to contradictory information about their true purpose. Some of them break free from their conditioning completely. Others experience what the files call cognitive fracturing, they become unreliable assets. Steele scrolled through more files, finding psychological evaluations of dozens of Garden operatives. Some showed signs of what the clinical notes described as programming degradation. Others appeared to be functioning normally according to their original conditioning. A few were marked as potentially compromised and scheduled for what the files euphemistically called permanent retirement. These people who might help us, Steele said, how do we contact them without alerting the conspiracy? Elena reached into her jacket and produced another device, this one smaller than her phone. This is a communication system designed by Sarah before she was killed. It uses encrypted frequencies that aren't monitored by standard intelligence gathering systems. She managed to contact 3 other operatives before they got her. Are they reliable? I don't know, Colonel. But they're all we have. The alternative is trying to convince people who might be part of the conspiracy that a conspiracy exists. And, given what happened to Sarah when she tried to go through official channels, I don't think that's a viable option. Steele stood and walked to his window, staring out at the Washington skyline. Somewhere in the city, maybe even in the building where he stood, were people who had spent decades planning the destruction of everything he'd sworn to protect. The irony wasn't lost on him. The Pentagon, symbol of American military might, had been infiltrated so completely that its own defense systems could be turned into weapons of mass destruction. Colonel, Elena said softly, there's something else in those files you need to see. Something about Phantom 7 that even the conspirators don't fully understand. Steele returned to the computer and opened the file Elena indicated. What he found made his blood turn to ice. Phantom 7 wasn't just a defense system, it was connected to America's nuclear arsenal. The authorization codes the conspirators had stolen could be used to launch nuclear weapons against American targets while making it appear that the orders had come from the president himself. They're planning to nuke American cities, Steele whispered. Frame the government for attacking its own people, then use the chaos to implement martial law under their control. The ultimate coup, Elena agreed. Destroy democracy by using its own defense mechanisms against it. And they're less than 3 days away from pulling it off. Steele felt the walls of his office closing in around him. He was looking at evidence of the most sophisticated and devastating attack on American democracy in the nation's history. An attack carried out by Americans against Americans, using systems designed to protect the country to destroy it instead. We need help, he said finally. But we can't trust anyone in the official intelligence community. Too many people could be compromised. I have an idea, Elena said hesitantly. It's dangerous, and it means trusting people we can't fully verify. But it might be our only chance. Tell me. There's a network of former military and intelligence personnel who've been quietly investigating anomalies in the defense establishment for years. People who were forced out for asking too many questions, or who retired early because they suspected something was wrong. They call themselves the Watchers. Steele had heard rumors of such a group: retired generals, former CIA analysts, discharged soldiers who claimed they'd discovered evidence of domestic threats but couldn't prove their allegations through official channels. Most active personnel dismissed them as conspiracy theorists and malcontents.
But, given what he now knew, their paranoia might have been justified. How do we contact them?
One of the garden operatives I mentioned, a man named David Chen, made contact with the Watchers before the conspiracy killed his handler. According to Sarah's notes, they were preparing to move against garden operations when everything fell apart. Elena activated her communication device and typed a brief message.
Within seconds, a response appeared on the small screen.
"He's alive," she said with obvious relief. "David's alive, and he says the Watchers are ready to help. But they need proof that Phantom 7 has been compromised."
Steele looked at the massive collection of evidence displayed on his computer screen.
Financial records, operational plans, psychological profiles, technical specifications, enough information to expose a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of American government.
But, would it be enough to convince people who had spent years being dismissed as paranoid fantasists?
"Elena," he said slowly, "if we do this, if we contact these Watchers and try to expose this conspiracy, there's no going back. We'll be marked for death by some of the most dangerous people in American intelligence. People with access to resources we can't imagine and a willingness to kill anyone who threatens their operation."
Elena met his eyes steadily.
"Colonel, I've been marked for death since the moment I discovered the truth about the garden. The only difference is that now I have a chance to stop them before they destroy everything decent people have died defending."
Steele nodded slowly.
She was right, of course. The conspiracy had already killed Sarah and countless others who had stumbled onto their secret. There was no safe option, no way to quietly walk away and pretend none of this had happened. The only choice was between fighting back and waiting to die. "All right," he said, reaching for his secure phone.
"But we do this my way.
No amateur operations, no half-planned missions.
If we're going to stop the most dangerous conspiracy in American history, we're going to do it right." As he began to dial, Elena placed a hand on his arm.
"Colonel, there's one more thing.
Something I haven't told you yet because I wasn't sure you'd believe me." "What is it?"
"I think I know who's really behind all this. The financial records in those files, when you trace them back far enough, they all lead to the same source. Someone who's been in a position to influence American intelligence policy for decades. Someone with the authority to authorize programs like the Garden and the resources to maintain them in absolute secrecy."
Steele's finger hovered over the phone keypad. "Who?"
Elena's voice was barely above a whisper when she answered. "General Morrison, the Deputy Secretary of Defense. The man who signs your orders, Colonel. The man who could walk into this office right now and have us both arrested for treason.
He's not just part of the conspiracy.
According to these files, he's been running it for the last 15 years. The abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Arlington looked like any other decaying industrial building in the shadow of Washington, D.C. Broken windows stared blindly at the street, and rust stained the corrugated metal walls like dried blood. But Colonel Steele knew that appearances could be deceiving. As Elena led him through a maze of shipping containers and debris, he realized this wasn't just an abandoned building, it was a fortress. Motion sensors tracked their movement with subtle clicks and whirs. Hidden cameras recorded their approach from multiple angles. Steel plates had been welded behind the broken windows, turning them into firing positions that commanded a clear view of all approaches.
Someone had transformed this forgotten piece of urban decay into a sophisticated observation post.
"David's been expecting us," Elena said as they approached a heavy steel door that looked like it belonged on a bank vault rather than a warehouse. She pressed her palm against a scanner hidden beneath a layer of rust and grime, and the massive door swung open with barely a whisper of sound. Inside, Steele found himself in what looked like a military command center that had been transplanted into an industrial setting. Banks of computer monitors lined the walls, displaying surveillance feeds from around the city. Communication equipment that he recognized as military-grade filled several tables, and maps covered in colored pins and string showed patterns that made his tactical mind race with possibilities. 3 people were waiting for them in the center of the room, and Steele immediately understood why Elena had trusted them. They all had the same look he'd seen in Elena's eyes, the weight of carrying terrible knowledge, the exhaustion that came from fighting a war that most people didn't even know was happening. David Chen was smaller than Steele had expected, but his movements had the precise economy of someone trained for violence. Like Elena, he appeared to be in his early 20s, but his eyes held decades of experience. The woman beside him was older, maybe 40, with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent years in harsh environments. The third person was a surprise, a teenage boy who couldn't have been more than 16.
"Colonel Steele," David said, extending a hand. "Elena told me you had access to classified materials that could help us understand the scope of the conspiracy." "I hope she wasn't exaggerating."
"I wish she was," Steele replied, shaking hands with each of them in turn. The woman introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Martinez, not the Sarah who had been killed, Elena explained, but a former Defense Department psychologist who had first identified the Garden's programming techniques. The teenager was Marcus Webb, a computer prodigy who had been recruited by the conspiracy but had escaped before his programming could be completed. "Show them what we found," Elena urged, and Steele activated the portable secure terminal he'd brought from the Pentagon. The files from Elena's flash drive filled the screens around the room, painting a picture of treason so vast that even these battle-hardened individuals fell silent as the evidence mounted. Dr. Martinez was the first to speak. "Jesus," she whispered, staring at the psychological profiles of Garden operatives.
"I wrote some of these reports.
I thought I was helping to evaluate special operations candidates for psychological fitness. I had no idea they were using my work to refine their programming techniques." Marcus leaned over her shoulder, his young face pale as he read clinical notes about cognitive modification procedures. "This explains so much," he said quietly. "The memory gaps, the skills I couldn't remember learning, the way certain phrases would make me feel like I was sleepwalking through my own life." David was studying the technical specifications of the surveillance devices, his expression growing darker with each page.
"These aren't just passive monitoring systems.
According to these schematics, they can actually interfere with military communications systems. In a combat situation, they could cause friendly fire incidents, misdirect artillery strikes, even prevent evacuation orders from reaching endangered personnel." "It gets worse," Elena said, guiding them to the files about Phantom 7. As the group read about the conspiracy's plan to use America's own nuclear arsenal against American cities, the room fell into a silence so complete that Steele could hear the hum of the ventilation system in the walls.
72 hours, Dr. Martinez said finally.
"We have 72 hours to stop them from turning our own defense systems into weapons of mass destruction."
"How is that even possible?" "It's not," David said flatly. "Not through official channels.
If General Morrison is really behind this, he can classify any investigation, reassign any personnel who get too close to the truth, even order military action against anyone he claims is a security threat. He has the authority to declare martial law and suspend constitutional protections if he can create a sufficient crisis." Steele had been thinking the same thing during the drive to the warehouse. Morrison wasn't just another conspirator, he was positioned to control the American response to any crisis he chose to create. If the conspiracy succeeded in launching even a single nuclear weapon against an American city, Morrison could use the resulting chaos to seize control of the government itself. "There might be a way," Marcus said hesitantly, his fingers flying over a keyboard as he accessed systems that made Steele deeply uncomfortable. "I've been tracking communication patterns between Pentagon personnel for months, looking for signs of the conspiracy. I think I've identified most of the key players, but, more importantly, I think I know who's not part of it."
The teenager's screen filled with a complex network diagram showing communication flows between hundreds of Pentagon personnel.
Some nodes were highlighted in red, others in green, and a few glowed ominous orange. "Red nodes are confirmed or suspected conspirators," Marcus explained. "Green nodes are people who appear to be clean. Orange nodes are people I can't classify, they might be unknowing pawns, or they might be so deep undercover that their true allegiance is impossible to determine."
Steele studied the diagram, recognizing many of the names.
General Patricia Walsh, whom the files had identified as a conspirator, showed multiple communication links to other red nodes. But there were also green nodes in positions of significant authority, people with the clearance and resources to take action if they could be convinced of the conspiracy's existence.
"Admiral Jennifer Hayes," Steele said, pointing to a prominent green node.
She's been suspicious of Morrison for months, asking questions about budget allocations and personnel assignments that didn't seem to make operational sense.
If anyone would be willing to listen to evidence of a conspiracy, it would be her. The problem is convincing her without alerting Morrison, David pointed out.
If we approach her through normal channels, Morrison will know within hours. And, if he suspects we're onto him, he might accelerate the timeline. Dr. Martinez had been studying the psychological profiles of garden operatives, making notes on a yellow pad.
I have an idea, she said slowly. It's risky, but it might give us the opening we need.
She turned to face the group, her expression grim but determined. According to these files, there are currently 17 garden operatives in positions where they could access Phantom 7 authorization codes. But the psychological evaluations suggest that at least 6 of them are experiencing programming degradation. They're beginning to remember their true identities and question their conditioning.
You want to try to turn them, Elena realized. Convert enemy assets into allies. Not convert. Awaken. These people aren't traitors by choice, they're victims of sophisticated psychological manipulation. If we can break their programming, they might be willing to help us stop the conspiracy that enslaved them.
Marcus was already pulling up personnel files, cross-referencing the psychological evaluations with current duty assignments.
Here, he said, highlighting several names. Captain Rebecca Torres, stationed at NORAD. Lieutenant Commander Jason Wright at Strategic Command. Major Linda Foster at the Pentagon itself. All of them have clearance levels that could give us access to Phantom 7 protocols.
And all of them are showing signs of psychological instability, David noted, reading over Marcus's shoulder. According to these evaluations, they're experiencing memory fragments, emotional disruption, and questioning their orders.
Classic signs of programming breakdown.
Steele felt a chill as he realized what they were contemplating. You're talking about deliberately triggering psychological breakdowns in active military personnel. People with access to some of the most dangerous weapons systems in the world. People who are already breaking down, Dr. Martinez corrected.
We'd just be accelerating a process that's already begun.
And if we do it right, we can guide their awakening in a way that helps them maintain their sanity while recovering their true identities.
Elena was studying the files of the 3 officers Marcus had identified. How would we even contact them?
They're in secure facilities, surrounded by people who might be part of the conspiracy.
We can't just walk up to them and say, "Excuse me, but your entire life is a lie."
Leave that to me, Marcus said with the confidence of youth. I've been monitoring Pentagon communications for months. I know their schedules, their habits, their communication patterns. More importantly, I know how to create private communication channels that won't be detected by normal surveillance systems. Dr. Martinez nodded approvingly. We start with Captain Torres. According to her psychological profile, she's been experiencing the most severe programming degradation. She's also stationed at NORAD, which gives her access to early warning systems that could help us detect when the conspiracy begins their attack.
And if this backfires? Steele asked. If we trigger a complete psychological breakdown in someone with access to nuclear weapons?
Then, we're no worse off than we are now, David said grimly. In 68 hours, the conspiracy is going to turn those same weapons against American cities. At least this way, we have a chance of stopping them. The room fell silent as everyone contemplated the magnitude of what they were planning. They were talking about conducting an unauthorized psychological operation against American military personnel, based on evidence that most people would dismiss as elaborate fantasy. If they were wrong about the conspiracy, they would be guilty of everything from treason to assault on military personnel. If they were right but failed to stop the attack, millions of Americans could die in nuclear fire.
There's another problem, Elena said quietly.
Even if we succeed in awakening these operatives and gaining access to Phantom 7, we still need to physically stop the conspiracy from launching their attack. According to the files, they're using a distributed network of garden operatives embedded throughout the military hierarchy.
We can't just shut down the system, we need to eliminate the human components.
The implications hung in the air like poison gas.
They weren't just talking about exposing a conspiracy or preventing an attack. They were talking about killing American citizens, even if those citizens were traitors and murderers. The moral complexity was staggering. "One thing at a time," Steele said finally. "First, we try to contact Captain Torres and see if we can break her programming without causing a complete breakdown. If that works, we move on to the others. Once we have allies inside the system, we can start planning our next move." Marcus was already working on his computer, fingers flying over the keyboard with practiced precision. "I'm creating a secure communication protocol that will route through civilian internet infrastructure. It'll look like routine data traffic, but it'll carry encrypted messages that only Torres will be able to decode, assuming her Garden programming included the communication protocols I think it did." "What if it didn't?" Elena asked. "Then, she'll ignore the message as random data, and we'll have to find another way to reach her," Marcus replied without looking up from his screen. "But, based on the programming documentation in your files, all Garden operatives were given the same basic communication suite. It should work." Dr. Martinez was preparing what she called a cognitive trigger sequence, a carefully crafted message designed to activate the parts of Torres's mind that the Garden's programming had suppressed. "The key is to present information in a way that bypasses her conscious defenses and speaks directly to her suppressed memories," she explained as she typed. "Too aggressive, and will trigger a psychotic break. Too subtle, and the programming will filter out the message before it reaches her true consciousness." Steele watched the group work, marveling at the strange circumstances that had brought them together. A fugitive spy, a disgraced psychologist, a teenage hacker, and a disillusioned intelligence operative, hardly the team anyone would choose to save American democracy. But they were what he had, and time was running out. "Message is ready," Marcus announced. "All I need is Dr. Martinez's trigger sequence, and I can send it to Captain Torres. She should receive it during her next scheduled communication check, which is..." He consulted another screen, in 47 minutes. "Send it," Steele decided. "And God help us all if we're wrong about this." As Marcus transmitted the message that could either save their mission or destroy it completely, Elena moved to stand beside Steele. "Colonel," she said quietly, "there's something else I need to tell you. Something I discovered in the files but didn't mention earlier because I wasn't sure how you'd react." Steele felt his stomach drop. "What is it?" "The conspiracy's plan doesn't end with the nuclear attack on American cities. That's just the beginning. According to the operational timeline, they're planning to use the resulting chaos to implement what they call Phase 8, the systematic elimination of anyone who might pose a threat to their new order." "Elimination?" Elena's voice was barely a whisper. "They have kill lists, Colonel. Thousands of names of military officers, intelligence analysts, political figures, even journalists and academics who might be able to expose what really happened. Once they consolidate power, they're planning to hunt down and murder anyone who could threaten their control." The scope of the conspiracy's ambitions hit Steele like a physical blow. They weren't just planning a terrorist attack or a military coup. They were planning genocide, the systematic murder of everyone who represented the values and institutions of democratic America. "How long do we have?" he asked. "If their timeline holds, Phase 8 begins 24 hours after the nuclear attack. Less than 4 days from now." Steele looked around the room at his unlikely allies, realizing that they weren't just fighting to prevent an attack. They were fighting for the very survival of American democracy, and, quite possibly, for their own lives. In less than 4 days, if they failed, the United States of America as it had existed for over 2 centuries would cease to exist. "Marcus," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind, "I need you to set up communication links with every clean military officer you can identify. We're not just trying to stop an attack anymore. We're organizing a resistance." Captain Rebecca Torres stared at her computer screen in the depths of NORAD's Cheyenne Mountain complex, trying to make sense of the message that had just appeared in her routine communication queue. The text looked like random data at first glance, a jumbled collection of letters and numbers that her training told her to ignore as system noise. But something about the pattern made her pause.
Her fingers moved across the keyboard almost without conscious thought, applying a decryption algorithm she couldn't remember learning. As the message decoded, Torres felt a strange sensation, like waking up from a dream she hadn't realized she was having.
Rebecca, if you're reading this, then part of your true mind is still intact. Your name is Rebecca Torres. You were born in San Antonio, Texas, on March 15. Your mother's maiden name was Delacroix. You wanted to be a veterinarian before they took you. The words hit her like physical blows, each sentence unlocking memories that felt both foreign and familiar. Images flashed through her mind: a small house with a garden where she'd played with a golden retriever named Buddy, a mother who sang Spanish lullabies, dreams of healing animals that had been buried so deeply she'd forgotten they ever existed. But, even as the memories surfaced, another part of her mind was screaming warnings. This was an enemy psychological operation. Someone was trying to compromise her loyalty, to fill her head with false memories designed to make her question her duty. She should report the message immediately, submit to psychological evaluation, protect the mission above all else. The conflict between these two sets of thoughts created a pain so intense that Torres gripped the edge of her desk until her knuckles turned white. She was Captain Rebecca Torres, dedicated officer of the United States Air Force, protector of American airspace. But she was also Rebecca Delacroix, a little girl who had wanted to heal rather than harm, who had been stolen from her family and transformed into something she never chose to become. The message continued, and, with each word, the programming that had controlled her life began to crack like ice in spring. You were taken at age 9 from a foster home in El Paso. They told your foster parents you had been selected for a special educational program. You've been living a lie for 14 years, Rebecca. But, you can choose to remember who you really are. Torres's hands shook as she read instructions for secure communication protocols, contact information for people who claimed they could help her, and, most shocking of all, evidence that she was part of a conspiracy to attack the very country she thought she was protecting. 200 miles away in the warehouse, Marcus watched the response indicators on his screen with growing excitement. "She's accessing the files," he announced to the group. "Captain Torres is downloading everything we sent her. Her biometric readings show extreme stress, but she's not reporting the contact to her superiors." Dr. Martinez leaned over his shoulder, studying the psychological indicators. "She's fighting the programming. The conflict between her conditioned responses and her emerging true memories is creating cognitive dissonance, but she's not breaking down completely. This might actually work." Elena was monitoring news feeds from around the country, looking for signs that the conspiracy had detected their activities. "Any word from the other targets?" Lieutenant Commander Wright responded an hour ago, David reported from another terminal. "He's requesting a face-to-face meeting. Says his memories are returning, but he needs proof that this isn't an enemy operation before he'll fully commit." "And Major Foster?" David's expression grew grim. "No response yet." Her psychological profile suggested she might be the most difficult to reach. The programming runs deeper with her, and she's been in position at the Pentagon for almost 7 years. She might be too far gone to save. Steele was studying intelligence reports that Marcus had intercepted from Pentagon communications systems. "We're running out of time anyway. Morrison has accelerated the timeline. According to these intercepts, Phase 7 is now scheduled to begin in 36 hours, not 72. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Their already impossible deadline had just become even more impossible. "Why the acceleration?" Elena asked. "Unknown. But I'm seeing increased activity among personnel identified as conspirators. Extra security details, changes in duty schedules, unusual movement of equipment. They're preparing for something big." Marcus's computer chimed with an incoming message. "Torres is requesting immediate communication. She's found something in the NORAD systems that she says we need to know about right away." Within minutes, they had established a secure video link with the NORAD facility. Captain Torres appeared on screen, her face haggard but determined. The confusion that had marked her earlier messages was gone, replaced by the focused intensity of someone who had found her purpose. I've been reviewing the early warning systems, she said without preamble.
Someone has been making modifications to the threat detection protocols over the past 6 months. Small changes, individually meaningless, but together they create a blind spot in our sensors. She shared her screen, showing a map of North American airspace with colored overlays indicating radar coverage. Look at this corridor, she said, highlighting a narrow gap in the detection grid.
It's perfectly positioned to allow undetected entry into U.S. airspace from the north.
Something the size of a small aircraft could fly through here without triggering any alarms.
Elena felt ice forming in her stomach. They're not just planning to use our nuclear arsenal against us. They're planning to make it look like a foreign attack.
Fly in through that corridor, launch the attack, then blame it on enemy forces that supposedly penetrated our defenses.
It gets worse, Torres continued. I've been analyzing the modifications, and they're designed to be reversible within minutes. After the attack, they could restore normal sensor coverage and claim that the enemy used some kind of stealth technology that temporarily blinded our systems.
Steele was already thinking through the implications.
Perfect cover story. A foreign attack that our systems failed to detect until it was too late.
Morrison could declare martial law, suspend constitutional protections, and begin hunting down anyone he claimed was working with the enemy.
Captain Torres, Dr. Martinez said, leaning into the camera view, do you have access to the authorization codes for the systems that were modified? Some of them.
But the really critical codes are held at higher clearance levels.
I'd need help from someone with Phantom 7 access to completely reverse the modifications. David was studying personnel files on his screen.
Major Foster at the Pentagon would have that level of access.
Has there been any response from her yet? Marcus shook his head. Nothing.
She might not even be seeing our messages. Her duty station keeps her in secure areas where personal communication is heavily monitored. Then, we need to reach her in person, Elena said.
I can get into the Pentagon. I've done it before. Absolutely not, Steele said firmly. The Pentagon is crawling with conspirators who would recognize you on sight. It's suicide. Maybe not, Marcus interrupted, his fingers flying over his keyboard. I've been monitoring Major Foster's schedule.
She has a medical appointment tomorrow morning at Walter Reed Hospital.
If we could intercept her there, away from Pentagon security. Still too risky, David objected.
Medical facilities have their own security systems, and Foster might not be traveling alone. Elena was already moving toward an equipment locker, pulling out items that looked like civilian clothes but were obviously designed for covert operations.
We're out of options and almost out of time.
In 34 hours, they're going to start a nuclear war and blame it on foreign enemies.
Foster is our best chance of stopping them.
Steele watched Elena check her equipment with the practiced efficiency of a seasoned operative, and realized she was right. They had pushed their luck as far as it would go with remote communications and hacking operations. Now they needed someone to take direct action, and Elena was the only one with the training and clearance to attempt such a mission.
Captain Torres, he said, turning back to the video link, if we can get Foster's authorization codes, how quickly can you reverse the sensor modifications? Once I have the codes? Maybe 15 minutes to completely restore normal coverage.
But, Colonel, there's something else you need to know. I've been monitoring communications traffic, and I'm seeing patterns that suggest the attack might be imminent. Lots of coded traffic between facilities that shouldn't be communicating with each other. Marcus was nodding as he read data streams on his own screens.
She's right. I'm seeing the same patterns. Whatever they're planning, it's starting to happen now.
Elena was ready to go, her civilian disguise complete except for the weapons concealed beneath her jacket.
David, I need you to coordinate with Torres.
Monitor her progress on the sensor modifications and be ready to provide support if things go wrong. Marcus, keep tracking Pentagon communications. If Morrison or his people realize what we're doing, we need to know immediately.
What about me? Dr. Martinez asked. You're our insurance policy, Steele replied. If Elena successfully contacts Foster but can't break her programming remotely, you'll need to guide the deprogramming process in real time. Can you do that over a communication link?
Dr. Martinez considered the question.
It's not ideal, but yes.
The key will be identifying the specific triggers that can bypass Foster's conscious defenses.
If Elena can establish communication and buy us enough time.
I can handle Foster, Elena said with quiet confidence. The question is whether we can stop the conspiracy once we have access to their systems.
Even if we prevent this specific attack, they still have dozens of operatives embedded throughout the military.
They could try again next week, next month, or next year. The room fell silent as everyone grappled with the scope of their challenge. They weren't just trying to prevent a single attack, they were fighting to dismantle a conspiracy that had been decades in the making, using resources they barely understood against enemies who had infiltrated the highest levels of government. One crisis at a time, Steele said finally.
First, we stop the immediate attack.
Then, we figure out how to permanently disable their network.
As Elena prepared to leave for her mission, Torres's voice crackled through the communication link. Colonel, I'm getting alerts from the early warning system. Multiple aircraft approaching the sensor gap I identified.
They're still hours away, but they're coming in fast and low. Marcus's screens erupted with new data as Pentagon communications systems suddenly came alive with activity.
Emergency authorization codes are being transmitted, he announced, his voice tight with stress. Someone just activated preliminary launch sequences at multiple nuclear facilities.
Elena stopped at the door, her hand on the handle.
They're not waiting for their timeline. They're starting the attack now.
Steele felt the last of their remaining time slip away like sand through his fingers. The conspiracy wasn't waiting for the perfect moment, they were striking while the resistance was still organizing, before Torres could fully restore the sensor systems, before they could warn anyone who might be able to stop the attack. Elena, forget Foster, he said grimly. We need to move to Phase 2 immediately.
What's Phase 2? David asked.
Steele was already reaching for the secure phone that would connect him to Admiral Hayes and the other clean military officers Marcus had identified. We call in the cavalry and pray they believe us in time to prevent nuclear war.
As he began dialing, Elena paused at the door. Colonel, what if they don't believe us? What if we can't convince them in time?
Steele met her eyes steadily.
Then, we improvise.
And we pray that being right about a conspiracy is enough to save the country we've all sworn to protect. The phone was ringing, and, through the communication link with NORAD, they could hear alarms beginning to sound as Torres tried desperately to restore the sensor systems that might give America warning of its own destruction. In the distance, aircraft were approaching through a gap in the defenses, carrying weapons that would be used to justify the end of democracy itself. The final battle for the soul of America was about to begin. Admiral Jennifer Hayes was reviewing budget reports in her Norfolk office when her secure phone rang with the distinctive tone that meant emergency communication from Pentagon leadership. She expected to hear the voice of General Morrison or one of his staff, but instead found herself listening to Colonel Marcus Steele making claims so outrageous that her first instinct was to have him arrested for mental breakdown. Admiral, Steele's voice was steady despite the chaos she could hear in the background. I know how this sounds, but I have evidence of a conspiracy within the Defense Department to launch nuclear weapons against American cities. I need you to listen very carefully and act quickly, because we have less than 2 hours before they succeed. Hayes had known Steele for 8 years. He was a solid officer, methodical and reliable, not given to paranoid fantasies or dramatic gestures. The fact that he was making these claims at all was enough to give her pause.
Colonel, I'm going to need more than your word on something like this. What kind of evidence are you talking about?
The next 30 minutes changed everything Admiral Hayes thought she knew about the military she'd served for 22 years. As Steele transmitted files, video testimonies, and financial records that painted a picture of systematic infiltration and betrayal, she felt the foundations of her world cracking beneath her feet. The evidence was overwhelming.
Bank records showing payments to current Defense Department personnel from accounts linked to hostile intelligence services. Operational communications detailing plans to use American nuclear weapons against American cities.
psychological profiles of military personnel who had been subjected to illegal experimentation and conditioning from childhood. But it was the real-time intelligence that convinced her to act. As Steele spoke, his team was monitoring Pentagon communications and tracking the approach of unidentified aircraft through a deliberately created gap in American air defenses. She could hear Captain Torres at NORAD trying desperately to restore sensor coverage while alarms sounded in the background. Admiral, Steele continued, according to our intelligence, General Morrison is coordinating the attack from his Pentagon office. He has authorization codes for nuclear weapons systems, and he's already begun preliminary launch sequences. If you have any influence with other clean officers, we need to move now. Hayes was already activating her own secure communications, reaching out to the network of military leaders she trusted most. General Robert Chen at Strategic Command, Admiral Patricia Winters at Pacific Fleet, Colonel David Rodriguez at Northcom, officers whose integrity she'd never doubted and whose loyalty to the Constitution was beyond question. Within minutes, she had established a conference link between herself, these trusted colleagues, and Steele's team in their Virginia warehouse. As the evidence poured across their screens, she watched seasoned military leaders struggle to comprehend the magnitude of the betrayal they were witnessing. "This is impossible," General Chen said, his voice tight with disbelief. "The security protocols alone. Morrison couldn't authorize nuclear launches without multiple confirmations, fail-safes, verification procedures. He's not going through normal channels," Torres interjected from NORAD. "The authorization codes being used are Phantom 7 protocols, emergency procedures that bypass standard safeguards in the event of imminent national destruction. If Morrison claims we're under attack by foreign forces, he can launch without congressional approval or presidential authorization." Admiral Winters was studying the financial records, her expression growing darker by the minute. "I recognize some of these accounts. We've been tracking suspicious financial activity in Defense Department procurement for months, but we couldn't establish a pattern. Now I understand why the corruption was being coordinated from the very top." Colonel Rodriguez was monitoring real-time intelligence feeds from Northcom. "I'm confirming Steele's report about approaching aircraft. We have multiple contacts approaching through what appears to be a deliberate gap in our sensor coverage. Estimated time to target, 97 minutes. Hayes felt the weight of command settling on her shoulders like lead armor. In less than 2 hours, American nuclear weapons would be launched against American cities by American military officers who had been conditioned to believe they were protecting their country from foreign attack. The only way to stop them was to commit what could be considered mutiny against superior officers, an action that could end her career and land her in federal prison if she was wrong about the conspiracy. But if she was right and did nothing, millions of Americans would die in nuclear fire, and the Constitution she'd sworn to defend would be destroyed by the very people tasked with protecting it. "General Chen," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos of competing voices on the communication link, "what's your assessment of Strategic Command's vulnerability to this conspiracy?" "Unknown, Admiral. I can identify maybe a dozen officers whose loyalty I'd stake my life on, but Morrison has had years to place his people throughout the command structure. We could be walking into a trap." "Captain Torres," Hayes continued, "what's your status on restoring the sensor grid?" "I've restored about 60% of normal coverage, but I need authorization codes from Major Foster at the Pentagon to complete the process. And, Admiral, I'm seeing increased activity at multiple nuclear facilities. Launch preparations are definitely underway." Elena's voice cut through the discussion with urgent intensity. "Admiral, we don't have time for careful deliberation. My team has identified the aircraft approaching the sensor gap. They're carrying electronic warfare equipment designed to simulate a foreign attack. In about 90 minutes, those aircraft are going to broadcast false transponder codes that will make them appear to be enemy bombers penetrating American airspace." The tactical picture became crystal clear to Hayes in that moment. Morrison and his conspirators were creating a fake crisis that would justify their real nuclear attack on American cities. The false flag operation would provide cover for the greatest act of treason in American history. "All units," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had made an irrevocable decision, "we are now operating under emergency protocols to counter a domestic terrorist threat. General Chen, I need you to secure Strategic Command and
prevent any unauthorized launches. Admiral Winters, take control of Pacific Fleet assets and be prepared to intercept those aircraft if they enter American airspace. Colonel Rodriguez, coordinate with NORAD to restore full sensor coverage. Admiral, General Chen said carefully, what you're proposing could be considered mutiny if we're wrong about this conspiracy. And, if we're right and do nothing, we'll be accessories to mass murder and the overthrow of the American government, Hayes replied. I'd rather face a court-martial than explain to the families of nuclear attack victims why we had evidence of the attack and chose not to act. The next hour was a carefully choreographed dance of military precision and barely controlled chaos. Hayes and her allies moved to secure key facilities while Steele's team provided real-time intelligence about conspiracy movements. Elena finally made contact with Major Foster at Walter Reed Hospital, where the programming breakdown that Dr. Martinez had predicted was already in progress. Foster, it turned out, had been fighting her conditioning for months, experiencing memory fragments and emotional disruptions that made her question everything she thought she knew about her service. Elena's arrival with evidence of the conspiracy provided the final push that shattered her programming completely. Within 30 minutes of her awakening, Foster had transmitted the authorization codes that allowed Torres to completely restore NORAD sensor coverage. For the first time in months, American air defense systems could detect threats approaching from all vectors. But the conspiracy was adapting. As reports reached Morrison that his carefully positioned assets were being neutralized, he accelerated his timeline even further. Instead of waiting for the false flag aircraft to create a justification for nuclear response, he simply declared that intelligence services had detected an imminent foreign attack and began launching nuclear weapons against predetermined targets. Multiple launches confirmed, Torres reported from NORAD, her voice barely steady. Nuclear weapons are in the air, targeting Atlanta, Phoenix, and Seattle. Time to impact, 43 minutes. The warehouse fell silent as the magnitude of their failure sank in. Despite everything they had done, despite awakening the program assets and exposing the conspiracy, American nuclear weapons were now hurtling toward American cities. Morrison had been willing to sacrifice his perfect false flag operation to ensure that his coup attempt succeeded. But Hayes and her allies weren't finished. Years of training for the unthinkable scenario of nuclear warfare had prepared them for this moment, even if the enemy was domestic rather than foreign. General Chen, do you have control of strategic command? Affirmative, Admiral. Morrison's people tried to resist, but we have the facility secured. I'm tracking the launched weapons now. Can you abort them? Negative. These weapons were launched using Phantom 7 protocols that don't include abort codes. They're designed to be unstoppable once fired to prevent enemy interference with American nuclear response. Elena was studying the technical specifications of the weapons systems on her portable terminal. There might be another way, she said slowly. The weapons are using GPS guidance systems for final targeting. If we could disrupt those signals. Marcus was already working on his computer, his young face intense with concentration. I can do it. The GPS disruption equipment the false flag aircraft are carrying, I can turn it against the incoming warheads. Instead of creating false enemy signatures, we can use it to scramble the guidance systems on our own weapons. Will it work? Hayes asked. Maybe. GPS guidance failure would cause the weapons to miss their targets, possibly by hundreds of miles. They'd still detonate, but over unpopulated areas instead of major cities. It wasn't perfect. Nuclear weapons detonating over American territory would still cause massive environmental damage and economic chaos. But it was better than watching millions of innocent Americans die in nuclear fire. Do it, Hayes ordered. The next 20 minutes were the longest in American military history. As Marcus worked to reprogram the electronic warfare systems on the approaching aircraft, military leaders across the country watched the progress of nuclear weapons toward their own cities. In Atlanta, Phoenix, and Seattle, emergency services were attempting evacuations based on cryptic warnings from federal authorities, but there wasn't time to move millions of people to safety. GPS disruption is active, Marcus announced. Tracking systems show the weapons are deviating from their flight paths. On the screens around the warehouse,
they watched the missile tracks curve away from their original targets, following new trajectories that would take them over the empty desert of Nevada and the forests of Montana. The weapons were still armed, still dangerous, but they would fall on places where few people lived instead of America's major population centers. When the detonations came, they lit up the night sky over vast stretches of wilderness. The electromagnetic pulses knocked out power systems across 3 states, and the atmospheric effects created an artificial aurora that could be seen from space. But no major cities were destroyed, and the death toll was measured in dozens rather than millions. In the Pentagon, General Morrison realized that his conspiracy had been exposed and his attack had failed. As federal agents loyal to Admiral Hayes moved to arrest him, he made one final attempt to complete his mission, reaching for a backup nuclear authorization device that would target Washington, D.C. itself.
Elena was already moving, using skills programmed into her mind by the very conspiracy she was fighting to stop.
She reached Morrison's office through Pentagon security systems that still didn't recognize her as a threat, and stopped his final act of treason with precise efficiency. As dawn broke over Washington, D.C., the most dangerous conspiracy in American history was finally ending. Morrison and dozens of his co-conspirators were in custody. The Garden facilities were being raided by federal agents. The programmed operatives were being deprogrammed by teams led by Dr. Martinez. But the scars would take years to heal. Trust in American military leadership had been shattered. The constitutional crisis created by the attempted nuclear attack would require months of investigation and reconciliation. And the knowledge that American democracy had come within minutes of destruction would haunt everyone involved for the rest of their lives. Colonel Steele stood in the warehouse that had served as their headquarters during the crisis, watching the sunrise through dirty windows and marveling that they had lived to see it. Elena sat beside him, no longer the terrified fugitive who had walked into his office but not yet sure who she would become now that her conditioning was broken.
"What happens now?" she asked. Steele thought about the question.
The immediate crisis was over, but the work of rebuilding trust and ensuring this could never happen again was just beginning. There would be investigations, trials, reforms to the very structure of American intelligence gathering. And there would always be the knowledge that democracy was more fragile than anyone had imagined. "Now we do the hard work," he said finally.
"We make sure this never happens again. We rebuild the institutions that were corrupted. We heal the people who were hurt. And we remember that freedom isn't guaranteed, it has to be protected every single day by people willing to stand up for what's right." Elena nodded, understanding that her real life was just beginning.
The girl who had been stolen and programmed was gone, but the woman who had chosen to fight for truth and justice remained. Like America itself, she would have to define herself not by the damage that had been done to her, but by how she chose to move forward. In the distance, the Washington Monument stood unchanged against the morning sky, a reminder that even in the darkest hours, the ideals it represented could survive if good people were willing to fight for them. The conspiracy had failed, democracy had survived, and America would continue its imperfect but persistent march toward a more perfect union. The moment Elena had said Phantom 7 and watched Colonel Steele's jaw drop in complete shock had been the beginning of the end for the most dangerous conspiracy in American history. But it had also been the beginning of their understanding that protecting democracy required more than good intentions it demanded.